So we've got a bit of an update on Carlos Alcaraz's injury status. He wasn't on the entry list to Canada.
You go through a mountain of emotion.
An MRI scan can show a joint is structurally healed, but it cannot measure the violent shockwaves of a 5-set Grand Slam match. At 23, Carlos Alcaraz finally reveals the truth about his hidden medical scans. For 4 months, the diagnostic data coming out of Barcelona was locked behind a wall of silence. Ever since acute tenosynovitis flared inside his right wrist tendon sheath on April 14th at the Barcelona Open, the tennis world has relied on fragmented updates, while renowned physician Dr. Ángel Ruiz-Cotorro cleared the structural inflammation on his diagnostic scans. Static medical imaging tells only half the story. A tendon sheath can look pristine on an ultrasound while an athlete sits in a clinic. But when that joint is forced to absorb an incoming 135-mile-per-hour serve on fast acrylic concrete, invisible microscopic stress test failures instantly expose the truth. The hidden reality behind those medical clearances leaked out through harsh training limitations. Spanish insider Emilio Sanchez revealed that Carlos was training at barely 50% capacity, intentionally withholding maximum effort, serves to prevent scar tissue from re-tearing the joint. The crisis forced him to forfeit Roland Garros, miss Wimbledon, and surrender over 4,300 ranking points. Then came the high-stakes turning point in mid-August. Following his withdrawal from the Cincinnati Open, Spanish journalists José Morón and Fernando Perales confirmed that Carlos finally unlocked full training intensity in Murcia, sparring for hours with Holger Rune to test his wrist under match load. Now, under head coach Samuel López, the final travel verdict is locked. Carlos walks onto Arthur Ashe Stadium to defend 2,000 points completely cold. Since the Masters format began in 1990, not a single men's singles champion has ever won the US Open, after skipping both Canada and Cincinnati. Did the hidden medical scans reveal an athlete ready for war? Or is Carlos Alcaraz walking straight into a catastrophic physical trap? The untold story behind his diagnostic files exposes the fragile reality holding his career together. The human eye sees what an athlete wants it to see, but medical imaging never lies. When the sports world looks at a high-resolution MRI of a joint, most people look for broken bones or catastrophic ligament tears. If the bone is intact and the ligament hasn't snapped, the conventional assumption is that an athlete is cleared for battle. But inside the complex, microscopic anatomy of a modern tennis player's wrist, the line between structural healing and functional destruction is razor thin. That medical contradiction is the exact reason why the diagnostic reports surrounding Carlos Alcaraz were guarded like state secrets for 4 straight months. Under the clinical supervision of Dr. Ángel Ruiz-Cotorro in Barcelona, Carlos underwent continuous ultrasound evaluations, diagnostic MRIs, and soft tissue stress tests. By midsummer, those diagnostic scans showed what appeared to be great news. The acute inflammation inside the 6th extensor compartment had receded, and the extensor carpi ulnaris tendon sheath was structurally intact. On paper, the wrist was healed, but on a tennis court, a clean scan can be an illusion. To understand why, you have to examine the extreme kinetic violence that Carlos Alcaraz inflicts on his own body. Carlos doesn't just hit tennis balls, he attacks them with the fastest racket head speed the sport has seen in decades. When he loads on his back leg to unleash his signature forehand, his right wrist lays back into extreme radial deviation and deep hyperextension. At the precise moment of contact, his forearm muscles contract with violent force, snapping the wrist forward and upward to generate over 3,200 RPMs of topspin. That split-second whipping motion creates hundreds of pounds of downward torsional torque. Every single ounce of that kinetic shockwave channels directly through that tiny tendon sheath. When an athlete is resting in a medical clinic, an MRI scan captures a stationary joint under zero load. It cannot measure the sheer vibrational trauma of absorbing an 80-mile-per-hour heavy topspin ball on the run. It cannot measure how that tendon behaves after 3 hours of maximum physical exertion in 90-degree heat. And that is where the tragedy of Carlos's 23rd year began to unfold. The roots of this crisis stretch back to April 14, 2026, on Pista Rafa Nadal at the Barcelona Open. Carlos walked onto the clay to face Otto Virtanen, fighting through the match to secure a straight sets victory. But the moment the match ended and the adrenaline faded, the locker room became a scene of intense concern. The pain inside his right wrist was sharp, localized, and acute. Emergency scans in Barcelona revealed acute tenosynovitis, an aggressive inflammation of the synovial fluid lining the tendon sheath. Carlos immediately pulled out of his scheduled round of 16 match against Tomasz Mokac. Initially, his management team downplayed the severity, hoping a few days of rest and anti-inflammatory therapy would allow him to compete at the Madrid Masters. Then came the red carpet at the Laureus World Sports Awards in Madrid. For the first time, the public saw the true extent of the damage. Carlos arrived wearing a heavy, rigid black immobilizing splint locked over his entire right wrist and forearm. The purpose of that device was unequivocal: complete, absolute joint immobilization to prevent micro-movements from tearing the inflamed sheath. When journalists asked him if his French Open title defense was in jeopardy, Carlos delivered a remarkably sober confession: "I have a very long career ahead of me, many years, and pushing myself too hard at this French Open could seriously hurt my chances in future tournaments. I'd rather come back a little later and in top form than come back early, rushing, and out of shape." Those words marked the beginning of a devastating competitive blackout. The Grand Slam calendar showed no sympathy. Carlos officially withdrew from the Madrid Open and the Italian Open in Rome. In late May, he announced his withdrawal from Roland Garros, surrendering his French Open crown and 2,000 ranking points. Weeks later, the grass season brought another brutal blow. Carlos withdrew from Queen's Club and Wimbledon, watching his reigning championship points evaporate into thin air. Over 4,300 ranking points were erased from his profile in under 60 days. While Carlos sat in medical rehabilitation in Spain, Jannik Sinner swept through the summer swing, opening an insurmountable lead at world number 1, while Alexander Zverev pushed past him in the live standings. The pressure to return was immense, but the medical reality behind closed doors told a chilling story. Inside the private training facilities in Murcia, head coach Samuel López was forced to completely re-engineer the way Carlos Alcaraz interacts with a tennis ball. Samuel López, who officially took over as head coach following Carlos's separation from former coach Juan Carlos Ferrero in December 2025, refused to let external commercial demands destroy the young prodigy's physical future. Under López, Carlos had opened the 2026 season in historic fashion, winning 16 consecutive matches, conquering Novak Djokovic in Melbourne to win his maiden Australian Open, and complete a career Grand Slam, followed by another title in Doha. López knew that if they rushed a recovering tendon back to high-impact competition, they risked turning a temporary inflammation into permanent, career-threatening scar tissue. Working closely with equipment engineers and medical specialists, López made radical technical modifications. They lowered Carlos's racket string tension by 4 pounds, creating a looser, softer string bed designed to increase ball pocketing and absorb harsh impact vibrations before they could reach his forearm. They added extra dampening materials under his grip wrap to insulate the carpal bones. For weeks, Carlos trained with stringless frames, practicing slow-motion kinetic swings in front of mirrors to retrain his body to generate power from his core and hips, rather than relying entirely on his wrist snap. Yet, despite these precautions, insider reports exposed the alarming gap between medical optimism and actual match capability. Spanish tennis insider Emilio Sanchez leaked a sobering reality to European media. Carlos was operating at barely 50% of his normal physical capacity. Sanchez revealed that while Carlos could rally conservatively from the baseline, he was deliberately holding back on his first serve. The upward extension and violent downward pronation required to hit a 135-mile-per-hour flat serve was placing unsustainable torque on the extensor sheath. Stephen Smith, founder of global sports intelligence firm Kitman Labs, sounded an urgent alarm. Smith warned that entering best-of-5-set Grand Slam competition on hard courts under extreme heat and humidity when operating at 50% is the single highest welfare risk an athlete can take. The human body naturally compensates for an injured joint by transferring load to adjacent muscle groups, drastically multiplying the probability of secondary tears in the shoulder, elbow, or lower back. As the weeks dragged on, and official transparency remained minimal, the frustration inside the tennis community exploded into public controversy. On August 10, 2026, Dr. Gianni Daniele, chairman of the Medical Commission of the Italian Tennis Federation, gave an explosive interview to La Repubblica. Daniele publicly questioned the diagnostic secrecy coming out of Spain, claiming that the true severity of Alcaraz's wrist injury had been hidden to protect sponsor relationships and preserve market value. Daniele went even further, asserting that 4 months of isolation had created deep psychological vulnerability and internal panic inside Carlos's inner circle. The reaction across Spain was immediate and furious. Spanish media and former players condemned Daniele for offering unauthorized psychological diagnoses without ever examining Carlos's clinical records. Then came the devastating blow on the court. Carlos entered the Cincinnati Open, took his place as the number 2 seed, and let fans believe that his hard-court comeback was finally here. But after a single closed-door practice session in Ohio, the wrist flared with pain. Cincinnati tournament director Bob Moran stepped before reporters to confirm that Carlos had officially withdrawn. The withdrawal erased another 1,000 defending points from his profile, cementing his most extensive competitive absence and leaving him without a single hard-court preparation match before New York. The entire tennis world began to ask the unthinkable. Would Carlos Alcaraz be forced to shut down his entire 2026 season? The answer to that question arrived in dramatic fashion on Monday, August 17, 2026, in Murcia. With the US Open looming less than 2 weeks away, and the Cincinnati withdrawal behind them, Carlos and Samuel López knew they had reached their final deadline. They needed an absolute, unvarnished stress test under true match intensity. Spanish journalists, José Morón and Fernando Perales, broke the exclusive details of what unfolded. Carlos invited world number 7, Holger Rune, to his private training compound in Murcia. Rune, who was mounting his own grueling comeback from an Achilles tendon rupture suffered in Stockholm, brought world-class intensity to the court. For over 3 grueling hours under the scorching Murcia sun, Carlos wore a tight black compression sleeve on his right arm and pushed his body to the absolute limit. For the first time since April, Carlos did not hold back. He accelerated his racket head, stepped inside the baseline to rip high-velocity forehands, and unleashed full-power first serves directly at Rune. Rune pushed him into exhausting corner-to-corner baseline exchanges, testing Carlos's ability to slide, break, and absorb heavy ground strokes on the run. Eyewitnesses close to the session reported that the forehand exploded with familiar velocity and heavy topspin, and the wrist showed no immediate signs of swelling or acute distress. It was the definitive test they needed. The decision was finalized. Carlos Alcaraz would board the plane to New York to defend his US Open crown. August 30th, 2026, marks the beginning of the most dangerous high-wire act in modern tennis. Carlos Alcaraz will walk out under the towering floodlights of Arthur Ashe Stadium, carrying the monumental burden of defending 2,000 ranking points as the reigning US Open champion. He will do so, having played 0 sanctioned matches on hard courts in over 5 months. The historical odds standing against him are staggering. Since the ATP Masters 1000 format was established in 1990, not a single men's singles champion has ever won the US Open after skipping both the Canadian Open and the Cincinnati Open. 36 years of tournament records prove that winning 7 best-of-5-set matches requires competitive match repetitions under real scoreboard pressure to dial in timing, footwork rhythm, and crisis management. In a bizarre coincidence, world number 1 Jannik Sinner also withdrew from Cincinnati with a knee issue, meaning the 2 greatest young players on the planet are both stepping onto the biggest stage in sports without hard court tune-ups. Acrylic hard courts are ruthless. Unlike clay, which allows an athlete to slide and bleed off kinetic friction, hard concrete creates instantaneous, rigid traction. Every sudden stop sends violent shockwaves straight up through the ankles, into the knees, and directly into the forearm tendons. Every competitor in the US Open draw knows Carlos has not played a competitive point since April. Rival coaches are already designing aggressive tactical game plans. Opponents will deliberately feed heavy, high-kicking topspin deep into his forehand strike zone, forcing his right wrist to lay back and absorb awkward torque. They will pull him forward with drop shots and drag him into 40-ball physical wars under suffocating humidity to test his physical conditioning. The hidden medical scans showed that Carlos's wrist is structurally healed. Now, the entire sporting world is about to find out if human connective tissue can withstand the most punishing test in professional sports. A diagnostic scanner can measure the thickness of a tendon, but it can never calculate the heart of a champion. The tragic paradox of Carlos Alcaraz's 23rd year is that modern athletic medicine has made diagnostic imaging the ultimate judge of an athlete's reality. Dr. Angel Ruiz-Cotorro's scans proved that the physical tissue inside his sixth extensor compartment had recovered from acute tenosynovitis. But an ultrasound taken on an examination table cannot recreate the brutal, unscripted friction of a 4-hour baseline war. For 4 months, the Spanish camp protected those medical files like state secrets. They absorbed the loss of 4,300 ranking points. They endured the media storm ignited by Dr. Gianni Daniele's criticisms in the European press. They took the calculated risk to forfeit Cincinnati and surrender defending champion points. Under head coach Samuel López, the strategy was unambiguous. Protect the joint at all costs, lower the racket tension, and let the tendon sheath rebuild its structural integrity away from the media spotlight. Now, with the high-intensity sparring blocks alongside Holger Rune behind him in Murcia, Carlos has crossed the point of no return. The decision has been made to test that wrist under live tournament fire. If that repaired tendon sheath holds firm through 7 grueling rounds, it will stand as one of the most astonishing acts of athletic defiance in modern tennis history. But if those microscopic fibers buckle under the violent torque of 5-set hard-court tennis, the cost will reach far beyond a single tournament. The medical files are closed, the private tests are over, and the truth of Carlos Alcaraz's right wrist is about to be exposed to the entire world. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications right now so you catch our immediate tactical breakdowns and injury updates the moment tournament play gets underway.